"44 years later, and I still can't decide what's more frightening about Poltergeist. The clown, the tree, or the fact that somebody rated this movie a PG in the US. Okay, here are 5 good reasons why you should revisit Poltergeist. Reason 1, it makes you feel at home. And before we start, I should probably explain why we're beginning with Poltergeist, because the poll I put up asking you to choose the next 5 great reasons to revisit episode didn't exactly give me the decisive result I was hoping for. Poltergeist, Christine, and The Howling all finished on exactly 28%, which means you were absolutely no help whatsoever. So rather than choosing between them, I'm going to do all 3, and we're starting with Poltergeist. There's actually a nice bit of continuity here as well, because the last film we revisited was The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper in 1974, and just 8 years later, he's directing Poltergeist, a film that couldn't look or feel more different. And if you haven't seen that episode on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you can watch it right here. Obviously, it's almost impossible to mention Poltergeist without somebody bringing up the question of exactly how much Steven Spielberg had a hand in this himself. And Spielberg produced the film, co-wrote the screenplay, and was clearly heavily involved in the production, which has led to more than 40 years of debate about exactly where Hooper's influence ends and Spielberg's begins. But there are also people who were actually there, including Mick Garris, who has always strongly defended Hooper and maintained that he absolutely directed the movie. I'm not going to go too far down that particular rabbit hole, because this episode isn't about settling an argument that's been going on since 1982, but what I will say is that Spielberg's fingerprints are all over Poltergeist, and you can feel them almost immediately. The film opens with the Star-Spangled Banner playing on the television as the station closes down for the night, which in itself is an incredibly nostalgic image now. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the television actually finished for the evening and told you to piss off to bed. But there is something else about that opening that I really like, because while the national anthem is playing, we're being introduced to this almost perfect image of middle-class America. The Freelings have the house, the kids, the dog, the television and the neighbors, and they're living in this comfortable new suburban development where everything appears completely safe. And to some extent, they've achieved their own little version, I guess, of the American dream. And once we move outside, that Spielberg feeling becomes even stronger. Kids are riding BMXs around the streets, remote-controlled cars are buzzing along the pavement, families are moving between these almost identical houses, and the whole neighborhood has that very particular early 80s Spielberg quality that immediately makes me think of E.T., which of course was filmed slightly after this and released the very same year. I first saw Poltergeist sometime around 1983 or 84, I think. So I would have been about 10 or 11 years old, and I think I'd already seen E.T. by then. And at that age, I obviously wasn't sitting there analysing the relationship between a producer and a director, but I recognised that feeling straight away. It felt like Spielberg, and there was a warmth and a familiarity to the film that immediately drew me in. And somewhat shamefully, I don't even think my first experience of Poltergeist came from a legitimate VHS rental. I'm pretty sure it was a bootleg copy, probably several generations removed from whatever the original recording had been, but that was hardly unusual at the time. And what I remember is that even through that ropey copy, the quality of the production really struck me. This felt like a big movie, but at the same time, there was something incredibly intimate about the way we were introduced to the Freelings. Craig T. Nelson and JoBeth Williams have such an easy chemistry together that you immediately believe they're husband and wife, while Heather O'Rourke is incredibly natural as Carol Anna. Robbie's a good brother to her, and the other sister is your usual smart-assed, stroppy teenager. They argue and complain and genuinely make the house feel as though this family has been living there long before we arrived. Steve and Diane aren't presented as some impossibly wholesome American couple either. There's that wonderful little scene where they're smoking a joint in the bedroom while the kids are asleep, and it's a small moment, but it immediately makes them feel more relaxed. believable and human, I guess. And all of this matters because Poltergeist doesn't begin by desperately trying to frighten us. It spends time allowing us to settle in this house and become comfortable with this family so that when things eventually begin to go wrong, we actually care about what's happening to them. It's interesting coming to this directly after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because Hooper's earlier film makes you uncomfortable almost from the opening frame. And that film gives us an America that feels hot, grubby, decaying and dangerous, whilst Poltergeist gives us freshly built houses and manicured lawns and a seemingly perfect suburbia. Everything here looks really safe, but underneath both films, there's something rotten. And in Poltergeist, that's eventually going to become quite literal. But before we get there, though, the film starts placing little things around the Freeling house that, watching this when I was 10 or 11, were just unsettling enough to start playing with my imagination. And that brings me to reason number 2. Reason 2, it understands what scared us as kids. And one of the things I appreciate more about Poltergeist now is just how well it understands childhood fear. Because so much of what frightened me when I first watched this wasn't necessarily the ghosts or the big supernatural set pieces. It was the smaller things that were already familiar to me as a kid. There's the pet bird that suddenly dies. The huge twisted tree sitting directly outside Robbie's bedroom window, the dog reacting to things around the house that nobody else can see, and sitting there at the end of Robbie's bed is that bloody clown. I think most of us probably had something like that when we were younger, and it didn't necessarily have to be a clown. It might have been a doll or a teddy bear or a puppet or some completely innocent toy that your parents couldn't understand why you didn't like it. But there was something about its face or something about the way it looked that just wasn't quite right to you. Maybe the eyes were slightly too big, or maybe the smile looked different once the bedroom lights went out, or maybe there was absolutely nothing wrong with it whatsoever and your imagination had simply decided that this thing was going to murder you in your sleep. And the problem was that your parents couldn't see what you saw. To them it was just a toy. So they'd happily leave the bloody thing sitting on a chair at the end of your bed or turn the lights off and walk away, completely oblivious to the fact that as far as you were concerned, they'd left you alone with Satan until the following morning. And maybe you were too embarrassed to admit that you were genuinely frightened of it. So you just put up with it, knowing that every night when you went to bed, that thing was still sitting there. Poltergeist understands that feeling perfectly, but what's clever is that it doesn't immediately do anything with these fears. The tree remains outside Robbie's window, the clown remains sitting in the bedroom, and for a while the supernatural activity inside the house is actually presented as something fascinating rather than frightening. Spoons begin bending themselves, objects move around the kitchen, and then Diane turns away for a moment before discovering that incredible stack of chairs balanced on top of the kitchen table. And rather than running screaming from the house, she's fascinated by what's happening. And when she discovers that this invisible force will actually slide her daughter across the kitchen floor, she starts having fun with it. Jerry Goldsmith's score plays a huge part in creating that feeling because there's a sense of wonder to those early supernatural moments, almost as though the Freelings have stumbled across something magical inside their own house. But underneath all of that wonder, there's a slight sense of unease because we know things aren't quite right, even if the family hasn't realized yet. We've no idea how dangerous they're going to become. The dog is seeing things in the bedroom, Carol Ann is communicating with something through the television, and Robbie remains deeply uncomfortable about that tree outside. So there's always this feeling that we're simply waiting to find out how long this fun is going to last. And eventually, Poltergeist starts proving that Robbie had every reason to be frightened. The sequence where the tree crashes through his bedroom window and grabs him is still incredibly effective. particularly because it's another moment that could so easily have looked ridiculous. And when you actually describe what's happening, we're watching a giant tree attack a child and at one point seemingly try to swallow him, but the physical effects combined with Tobe Hooper's direction and Michael Kahn's editing give the whole sequence such speed and violence that you completely buy into it. And more importantly, when Diane and Steve are outside desperately trying to save Robbie, the attack has drawn everyone's attention away from what's happening inside the house, and that's when Carol Ann disappears. And for me, this is the moment where Poltergeist really kicks into gear, because suddenly the film, about 40 minutes in, I think it is, presents us with a concept that was incredibly frightening to me as a kid. Carol Ann simply hasn't wandered off, and she doesn't appear to have been kidnapped. Her parents search the house and can't find her anywhere, yet somehow they can still hear her voice coming through the television. So the question becomes really simple. Where is Carol Ann? She's somewhere. She can hear her parents, she can talk to them, and she knows they're looking for her, but nobody has the slightest idea where she actually is or how they're going to reach her. And that, for me, was genuinely frightening when I was 10 or 11, because it takes the safety of your own home and completely undermines it. Carol Ann hasn't disappeared while wandering through a dark forest or exploring some abandoned building. She's disappeared from her own bedroom, and while her parents are only a few feet away. And as the film continues, it rather cruelly keeps returning to those really basic childhood fears, proving that children were right to be frightened of them. Robbie was frightened of the tree, and the tree attacks him. And later he's going to look across his bedroom and realize the clown is no longer sitting where he left it. And for me, the moment when he sees that empty chair is almost more frightening than the attack that follows. Because every kid who was ever frightened of a toy had probably imagined exactly that same thing. You know, what if I look away from it tonight, and when I look back, it's moved? And that's what Poltergeist does so brilliantly. It doesn't need to invent elaborate new fears for children, because it understands the ones we already had. It takes the things sitting in our bedrooms, outside our windows and lurking in our imaginations, and then quietly suggests that perhaps we weren't being quite as silly as our parents thought we were. Reason 3 is the ultimate gateway horror movie. Every time I put on the 4K of Poltergeist, there's something right at the beginning that still makes me shake my head, because before the film even starts, we're greeted by this enormous blue MPAA ratings card telling us that the movie we're about to watch was rated PG. And even after all these years, I still find that absolutely staggering. Now, obviously this was 1982, which was 2 years before the introduction of the PG-13 certificate in the US. So there was this enormous gulf between a PG and an R rating that films like Jaws and Poltergeist could somehow fall into. And a couple of years later, it would be Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Gremlins. And those would become closely associated with the debate that eventually led to a PG-13. But watching Poltergeist today, you can see the problem existed well before either of those two films arrived. Because this movie goes to some really fucking dark places. And what's particularly interesting to me is that while America was allowing children into Poltergeist with a PG certificate, here in Britain we were heading in an almost opposite direction. Horror was becoming increasingly controversial in the UK, particularly once the video Nasty Panic gathered a load of momentum, and there was a growing concern about exactly what younger audience should and shouldn't be allowed to see. Poltergeist received a 15 certificate in the UK, which makes considerably more sense to me when you actually look at some of the imagery in the film. But the reason I'm including this as one of my 5 great reasons isn't because I think the MPAA got it horribly wrong. In a strange way, I'm actually quite glad an entire generation of us discovered Poltergeist when we were probably younger than we should have been, because I think it's one of the greatest gateway horror movies ever made. It has all the Spielberg warmth we've already talked about, and the early supernatural activity is presented with enough wonder and excitement to draw younger viewers in. But once the film decides it's time to frighten you, it doesn't suddenly start pulling its punches because children might be watching. The arrival of those paranormal investigators is where the seriousness of what's happening really begins to settle in. Dr. Lesh arrives with Ryan and Marty, and I love the fact that these aren't presented as people who have never encountered paranormal activity before. This is their job. They've investigated hauntings and they've seen things they can't quite explain, but when they're confronted with what's happening inside the Freeling house, even they look completely overwhelmed. And there's that wonderful moment when they see the bedroom with the bed rotating, records and objects flying around, and virtually everything in the room upended. It's the expression on Dr. Lesh's face that really sells it for me. She doesn't look fascinated or excited by what she's witnessing. She looks genuinely frightened because whatever experience these people have had in the past, they've clearly never seen anything on this scale. And I think that's a really effective way of telling the audience just how serious the situation has become without somebody having to stand there and explain it all to us. There's also a lovely, much quieter scene between Dr. Lesh and Robbie where they talk about what happens when we die. And I really like the fact that Poltergeist can stop for a moment and approach that subject from a child's point of view. It's a really gentle conversation about death and what might happen afterwards. And it starts preparing us for the idea that there are people who have died but haven't necessarily moved on. But almost immediately afterwards, the film goes from quietly discussing death in a really sort of tasteful way to giving us one of the most graphic scenes I think I've ever seen in a PG movie. Marty wanders into the kitchen and starts preparing some dinner, and his steak starts wandering across the worktop, and then all of a sudden it just starts to decay right in front of him. Then he looks down at the chicken that he's been eating, and it's just crawling with maggots, which probably would have been enough for most family movies to call it a day at that point. But Poltergeist has other ideas. He goes into the bathroom to sort of wash his mouth out and freshen up, looks into the mirror and starts tearing his own face apart. Chunks of flesh are pulled away until we're looking at a skull underneath, and famously Spielberg's own hands were used during parts of the effect to tear away this prosthetic flesh. And watching it now, it's still an incredibly graphic sequence. And when you combine it with the tree trying to devour Robbie, the clown attack that comes later on, and some of the things JoBeth Williams is subjected to during the final act, that PG certificate starts looking increasingly absurd, I think. But this is exactly why I think Poltergeist works so well as a gateway horror. It doesn't treat younger viewers as though they can't handle being properly frightened. And for those of us who saw it at 10 or 11 or 12 years old, it introduced us to genuine horror imagery while still giving us the security of characters and a world that feels familiar. It's frightening, sometimes surprisingly nasty, but there's always this emotional warmth underneath that stops the film becoming like relentlessly bleak. And I think that's why so many people of my generation remember it so vividly. It felt like proper horror. We just somehow got to watch it. Reason 4, you believe in this family, and for all the ghosts and special effects and huge set pieces in Poltergeist, I don't think any of it would work nearly as well if we didn't care about the Freelings. And the more times I watch this film, the more I appreciate just how important JoBeth Williams is to everything that happens. When Carol Ann disappears, it's interesting that Diane actually appears to hold things together better than Steve does. Craig T. Nelson gives a really good performance because you can see the situation gradually wearing Steve down. He looks terrible. He's frightened and exhausted and completely unable to understand how the comfortable life he's built for his family has suddenly fallen apart. Diane is obviously terrified, but she has something that keeps pushing her forward. She wants her daughter back. And there's a determination in JoBeth Williams' performance that never feels like the film is suddenly trying to turn Diane into some kind of action heroine. She's simply a mother who refuses to accept that Carol Ann is gone, and that becomes the sort of emotional backbone of the movie. I also really like the whole being skeptical about the skeptic angle this film tackles. Zelda Rubinstein makes an immediate impression as Tangina because she's so completely unlike anybody else we've met in the film, and she walks around the house, takes everything in, and almost immediately offers Diane something that nobody else has been able to give her this far. She tells her that Carol Ann is alive, and you can see the effect those words immediately have on Diane because it's the first time somebody has given her genuine hope. But if you watch Craig T. Nelson during that moment, there's something completely different happening on his face. He doesn't look relieved at all. He almost looks angry. And I've always read that expression as less of Steve simply refusing to believe Tangina and more as a husband thinking, don't you dare give my wife false hope with this. He's watched Diane go through hell and he doesn't yet know whether this woman is genuinely capable of helping them. So before he allows himself to believe her, he needs to know that she isn't simply telling his wife what she desperately wants to hear. And it's those smaller moments like that that make the Freelings feel believable. And these moments are the reason why the eventual rescue of Carol Ann carries so much emotional weight. When Diane Freeling finally goes through to the other side and returns with Carol Ann in her arms, the imagery feels almost like a rebirth. They're both covered in this strange organic ectoplasmic substance. Diane is cradling her daughter against her body, and after everything we've been through, she's essentially brought Carol Ann back into the world for a second time. And it's a genuinely emotional moment because the entire film has been building towards getting this little girl home. And when Tangina finally announces that the house is clean, we believe her because we desperately want the nightmare to be over as much as the Freelings do, which leads perfectly into my final reason. Reason 5, just when you think it's over, it's not. And one of my favorite things about Poltergeist is that it basically gives us the ending we want and then waits until we've relaxed before telling us that we've got another nightmare to get through, like a hidden third act. And Carol Ann is back, Robbie is safe, the paranormal activity has apparently stopped, and the Freelings have finally had enough of Cuesta Verde. They're packing everything up, they're getting out of the house, and there's this wonderful feeling that all they have to do now is survive one final night before they can put the whole thing behind them, and then we get the clown. For me, the moment when Robbie notices that clown has disappeared from the chair is still one of the best scares in the film because it goes straight back to that childhood fear we talked about earlier. He checks underneath the bed, finds nothing, comes back up, and suddenly the thing he's frightened of from the beginning is attacking him, strangling him. And at the same time, Diane is subjected to something far more aggressive. This invisible presence pins her down on the bed and attacks her in a sequence that always reminded me slightly of The Entity. There's something genuinely nasty and invasive about it, and particularly when you remember that earlier in the movie that invisible force has moved Carol Ann across the kitchen floor, and what initially seemed playful has now become completely malicious. Diane eventually escapes the bedroom and tries desperately to reach the children, which gives us another image that has always stuck with me. That corridor stretching away from her as she tries to run towards them. And we've probably all had the same version of that dream where we're desperately trying to get somewhere or to somebody, but no matter how hard you run, you just can't get any closer. You're being held back by something that you can't see, and Poltergeist takes that incredibly simple nightmare logic and puts it on screen. And it's something that Elm Street did a few years later when Nancy's trying to get up the stairs and her feet just sink into the staircase into that kind of like marshmallow glue. But here Diane can see where her children are. She just can't get to them. And then because apparently the film hasn't done enough to justify its PG certificate. She ends up falling into that unfinished swimming pool as coffins begin erupting around her from the ground. And the sequence is really chaotic, it's disgusting, and it's still incredibly effective, but with Diane desperately trying to climb out while decomposing corpses surface around her. And yeah, the story everybody has heard about apparently is true. Real human skeletons were used during the sequence because genuine anatomical skeletons were cheaper and more readily available than buying convincing artificial ones at the time. And JoBeth Williams has spoken about discovering that the skeletons she'd been thrashing around with in that pool weren't simply plastic props. And then we discover what's been going on all along. The cemetery hadn't really been moved, just the headstones. The bodies were still there under the house. And I love the fact that this brings us all the way back to the opening of the movie and that beautiful image of comfortable middle-class suburbia. The Freelings thought they'd bought their little piece of the American dream, but their perfect new neighborhood had quite literally been built on top of something rotten. And by the time Steve confronts his boss and realizes what has happened, there's nothing left to save. The family gets in the car and gets as far away from Cuesta Verde as possible, eventually arriving at Holiday Inn. And then comes that one final perfect joke. After everything this family has experienced, Steve pushes the television out of the motel room and leaves it outside on the balcony. And I don't blame him. And that brings me back to why I wanted to revisit Poltergeist in the first place. I first saw this film when I was around 10 or 11 years old, probably on a ropey bootleg VHS, and there were images in it that stayed with me for years afterwards. The tree, the clown, Carol Ann talking through the television, the face-tearing scene, and those bodies coming out of the swimming pool all had an impact on me at exactly the age when a film like this probably hits you hardest. But revisiting it now, there's more to Poltergeist than just simply remembering the things that frightened me as a kid. It's the warmth of the family, the performances, Jerry Goldsmith's wonderful score, the way that it captures that very particular sort of early 80s Spielberg suburbia, and the fact that underneath all the spectacle there's actually a very simple story about two parents desperately trying to get their daughter back. And these are just 5 reasons why I think Poltergeist is absolutely worth revisiting. There are obviously plenty more that I haven't mentioned, and that's where you guys come in. So let me know in the comments below what frightened you most about Poltergeist. How old were you when you first saw it? And most importantly, whether you can believe that this thing was a PG rating. It feels absurd to me, but hey, this was the 80s. And because the poll ended, as I said before, in a 3-way tie between Poltergeist, Christine and The Howling, we're not done. I'm going to do all 3. So 1 down, 2 to go. I'm Darren, this is Only Sans, and I'll see you next time.